the most damning indictments of President Trump's competence and character come from those who serve most closely with him in these highly sensitive national security positions, whether it's Rex Tillerson, his Secretary of State, who called him a moron, or James Mattis, his defense secretary, who never wanted to meet with the president, of course, his chief of staff, General John Kelly, as well, and John Bolton, his national security advisor. All of them emphasize the dangers that would accompany a second Trump term.
George Stephanopoulos needs no introduction. He is the venerated host of This Week and Good Morning America. He's also the author of the new book, The Situation Room. George, thanks so much for coming on the show. How are you doing?
Sure thing, Aidan. Good. How are you doing?
I'm well. I want to start with your new book, The Situation Room. It's a fascinating account of the vital complex that has served as a crisis center for presidents since the Kennedy administration. What made you want to write this book?
Well, because as you said, it's such a vital part of the White House. It's really the nerve center of the White House, the place where watch officers are tracking what's going on all around the world, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, also facilitating the president's communications out to the world as well. But then beyond that, it's also the room, now the series of rooms, where presidents make the most consequential national security decisions, whether it's President Obama taking out Osama bin Laden. We've seen President Biden there for hours upon hours in recent months, dealing with both Ukraine and the war in the Middle East. It's really, next to the Oval Office, I think, the most consequential room in the White House. And I hadn't done a book since my memoir All Too Human came out a long time ago, back in 1999. I had started a lot of other books. I fielded a lot of ideas, but when I heard the idea of the Situation Room, it came together in my mind right away. My only question was, has this book been done before? And there hasn't been a popular history ever. There was a book written by a former White House duty officer named Michael Bone back in the early 2000s, but nothing for more than 20 years. As soon as I knew that, I knew this would be a great way to tell the story of presidents over the last 60 years, to look at presidential decision making over the last 60 years, and to introduce some really fascinating characters to the country.
Every president has used the Situation Room differently, and I think that's one of the fascinating parts about this book, is that from chapter to chapter, you really get a sense of how the administration worked with regard to their use of this room. You mentioned Biden spending a lot of time there. How did Trump use the Situation Room?
Hardly at all. It was very difficult for me to figure out how to write that chapter, in part because so much has been written about Donald Trump, but also because of the way because of his aversion in some ways to the room. He didn't really go there much at all. He had a couple of staged photo ops there at various times. I ended up titling the chapter Postcards from the Edge, and it was really just a series of oral histories from people who worked with the president in these highly sensitive national security positions. And they had some pretty chilling tales to tell. People like Tom Bossert, his Homeland Security advisor, talking about not being able to set up a normal process, and coming out of a meeting with the president in the sit room where the first thing the president does is pick up his cell phone and call a reporter. The guy who's always projecting about leaks turns out to be the leaker in chief, according to Tom Bossert. You learn about something we've all seen in the indictment for the classified documents case, very lax dealing with classified information. Probably the most telling thing, and we've seen this in other places as well, the most damning indictments of President Trump's competence and character come from those who serve most closely with him in these highly sensitive national security positions, whether it's Rex Tillerson, his Secretary of State, who called him a moron, or James Mattis, his defense secretary, who never wanted to meet with the president, according to Tom Bossert, called him a madman running around in circles, and said he doesn't really care about bringing the country together. Of course, his chief of staff, General John Kelly, as well, and John Bolton, his national security advisor. All of them emphasize the dangers that would accompany a second Trump term.
And Tom Bossert, I would note, not a resistance liberal either. I mean, Trump could try and dismiss him as part of the deep state, but he's a conservative, and that's I think the
Well,
most
as is John Bolton, as
and
is John
James
Kelly,
Mattis,
as
right?
is James
Yes,
Mattis.
right,
Remember, these are all people he picked for
right.
these positions.
You had an interesting bit of reporting about his predilection for using the Situation Room for cable news chyrons.
This
What happened there?
I was just so shocked to hear this. It turned, he rarely, if ever, called down to the Situation Room. The duty officers couldn't really remember anything. One of the few requests he made of the Situation Room was asking them to uh, collect for him the chyrons, the banners that go across the bottom of the cable news stories. Not even the stories themselves. He just wanted a collection of the chyrons, which is just sort of it's an insight into what he cares about at one level, but it was also kind of one of the oddest requests the Situation Room had ever gotten.
Yeah, it's like having Roger Ailes in the White House, like just
Yeah,
truly obsessed with how it looks in the cable
yeah.
news studios. Now, reading about the Situation Room and the role that it plays in the functioning of the U.S. government, it was really striking, and to me, it showed how one precarious the world order is because so many of the outcomes that we see throughout the book are really on a razor's edge. And some of the accounts you have in here about how some of the presidents were totally checked out. I mean, I'm thinking of Nixon, who, went to bed hammered every night during the Watergate scandal. And it made me think about the current president and his predecessor, both of whom are obviously running for president now. There's no comparison to Nixon, but these are two people who I would say many Americans do not have faith that they have the strongest grip on what's going on, whether it's Biden from the perspective of his age or Trump from the perspective of his judgment. What's your assessment looking forward to the 2024 election of how both of these candidates for president operate in a time of crisis? When you were reporting out this book, what did you learn about the way that they operate?
Well, I mean, I think there's a wholesale difference. Is President Biden old? Yes, he's 81 years old. There's no question about it. Uh, does he have a wealth of uh, foreign policy and national security experience that he's brought to bear on the big issues of our time, whether they're the war in Ukraine or the war in the Middle East or the exit from Afghanistan? You can agree or disagree with various decisions the president has made, but he's shown that he is engaged with the job, and he's doing it from the perspective of someone who is approaching the interests of the country first. I mean, the evidence it's been compiled about President Trump, again, from those who are closest to him in these national security positions, is that he cares first and foremost about himself, and he looks at everything through the prism of how it's going to make him look or how it's going to affect his political position. And I just think it's a wholesale difference. There's really no comparison.
And I would also note that we were hearing this stuff about Trump and his administration during the Trump administration. It's
Right.
not like the administrations are airtight with the leaks that are coming out of them
Yeah,
until
from
the
people who
president
work
left
for him.
office.
Right.
Yeah. Now, in all of your reporting on all of these administrations going back to JFK, what would you say for the country and the world? What was the most dangerous moment in the Situation Room?
Who there's I'll throw out a couple. I mean, clearly 9/11. I mean, on 9/11, the United States was under attack, and the White House was a target, and everyone inside the White House believed that the White House was a target. I mean, one of the things I reported out that day, which was, one of the most impressive things I've ever been able to report on, is how the duty officers in the Situation Room that day, not only even those who were not on assignment that day, all rushed to the Situation Room knowing that it was a target, but knowing that this was the place that they had to be as well. They were asked three different times the morning of 9/11 to evacuate the Situation Room. Every single time they refused. And they finally the Situation Room director finally just handed out a series of index cards and asked them each to write out their name and social security number on it. That was going to be the kill list in case the White House was indeed hit that day. I think that the other one is you alluded to the situation with Nixon back during the first Yom Kippur War in October 1973. That was when the Watergate crisis was reaching its first full boil. It was the month that, Spiro Agnew resigned. The tapes were released. The first impeachment articles were drafted. It was the time of the Saturday Night Massacre. And at exactly that same time, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel, and the Russians tried to exploit that situation. And I tell the story in the book of, one of the most dramatic nights in the history of the Situation Room. As this was all unfolding, Richard Nixon's up in the old executive office building in his hideaway, drinking scotch and listening to listening to show tunes, and completely hammered, completely out of commission. So Henry Kissinger and his team have to make the decision as they see the Soviet ships start to move towards the Middle East on whether to raise the nuclear alert level on their own. This is, they raised it to DEFCON 3 with the president being completely out of commission. It had only been raised that high during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is, this is 2 steps away from full out war. It turned out to have worked. That signal that was sent by Kissinger did, pressure the Soviets to sort of fall back a bit. One of the other things that came out years later as well, though, is that when the Soviet archives were released, we found out that Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader at the time, was also completely out of commission. He was in his dacha outside of Moscow, completely hammered on sleeping pills and vodka. So he had this massive game of superpower chick in one of the most perilous moments in the history of the nuclear age, and both of the leaders were completely out of it.
I want to talk about some of news right now, which is the conviction of Donald Trump on 34 counts of falsifying business records, which is a felony conviction. It's punishable by incarceration, probation, or a fine. Obviously, very big deal. How do you approach covering this kind of subject where it's obviously a historic conviction of a former president and potential next president, but there are also questions about the way that this particular prosecution was brought? How do you approach covering that kind of story?
Well, I mean, I think you have to. I think you have to give, full coverage. You have to address all of the questions. But I think you have to begin by, and I felt this across the board with so many of the issues that we're dealing with the former president, in simply stopping and taking a breath and resisting the inexorable forces of normalization, which, drive throughout the media and the political world every single day. Just stop for a second and say, wait a second. Yeah, there may be questions about the prosecution, but a jury has spoken. 12 anonymous jurors have spoken, and they have said he is a convicted felon. In any other time in American history, obviously it's never happened before, that would be automatic disqualification from, running for president. But, yes, and then you hear all these people say, oh, but this wasn't the most important case. Okay, perhaps it was not. But how does that make it better? I mean, so yes, okay, stipulate that and say, well, actually, you're right. We've also never had a president of the United States who was, refused to adhere to the peaceful transfer of power, who's been indicted for trying to block and overturn an election, not only by the federal government, but also in the state, the state of Georgia, and he's an unindicted co-conspirator in 2 other states. He is a felon surrounded by felons, including several of his top advisors, even to this day. And he also has been indicted again for mishandling classified information, one of the most sensitive jobs that a president has to deal with. On top of that, he's faced civil judgments in the last 2 years by juries where he's been found liable for sexual abuse and for defamation. So, I mean, what you see here in all of these different situations is the president and the supporters trying to cherry pick questions about each individual one. When you look at the totality, it's a mind-boggling a series of indictments of the former president that, again, at any other time would have been considered automatically disqualifying.
Do you ever think that the media has failed in some way by not being able to convey to the American people? Because obviously Trump still has an enormous base of support in the United States, despite all of that. Do you blame the media at all? Do you think there's anything that could have been done?
Well, sure. We've all made mistakes. I mean, let's roll back the clock, go back to 2015. Was it a mistake to uh, give the president fairly open access to our airwaves in a way that you know in a way that allowed him to repeat falsehoods uh, and broadcast falsehoods, even when they were fact checked? But one of the things we all learned from this experience is that if someone's willing to persist in the face of fact checking, the fact checking loses its force. Now we're also in a world where, what does the media mean? So many of us live in our media silos that you know that we're that some of the president's most loyal supporters aren't even getting their news from anything like the traditional mainstream media. They may be getting it from Fox, they may be getting it from online. So much of it is false, but again, that doesn't seem to matter right now. I think this is such a bigger question. Have we failed in some ways? Of course we have, but he doesn't have the support for lack of people knowing the facts. The facts are out there. For whatever reason, people have chosen to ignore them, and we're in a different world. And that's one of the points I tried to make on my Sunday show several weeks ago. I mean, so much of our system relies not only on the belief in the peaceful transfer of power, but in the belief in civil debate, fundamentally based on facts, so that people can then make up their own mind. That's out the window. I mean, we now have a presidential candidate who's pursued a big lie about the 2020 election and convinced his most loyal supporters that it's the truth.
Right.
That's not because we sat there and said, didn't say hard enough, the election was not stolen in 2020.
I've long felt that Trump's superpower is a lack of shame. And you
Huge.
see it when he'll be up on a town hall stage or a debate stage or in an interview with a reporter, and he'll say 2 + 2 = 5, and we'll get fact checked, and we'll just keep barreling through. Or when there's a controversy and he doesn't apologize for it, when any other politician in the history of politics would.
But I think, and that means, it's going to be a challenge for those who are doing the debate in June. I mean, I think it's journalistic malpractice to do a live interview with President Trump on television. Because
what do you think
because
about because it sounds like the debates are going to have, they're going to have there's no audience. They're allowed to cut the mics. What do you think of the parameters around
that?
Helps.
Debate? I think that helps a bit. I don't know exactly how the mic thing is going to work. I mean, we'll see. But I do think that those conditions help a bit. But it's still a very, very complicated thing to do. And it's also, one of the former president's techniques is also simply to keep on changing the subject. I think that's something that has always been perilous, a challenge for interviewers, but the same thing will happen in the debate. I mean, I, for one, don't believe you can pretend that refusing to accept the 2020 election is on a par with other issues. Right. It's kind of
it's the fundamentally one.
It's as fundamental as it gets. Is that going to be put in the proper context in the debate? I think that's one of the big questions.
Right. And do you think that CNN's hosting the first debate, ABC News is hosting the second?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that these networks are prepared and are going to be able to handle this in an effective way, or do you fear that we might have a repeat of the Chris Wallace hosted debate from 2020?
We're moving on.
It didn't take them.
Well, Vice President,
Chris, can I be honest? It's a very important
try to be
question.
honest.
He stood up.
No,
he stood up
the answer to the question is no.
Ukraine.
No, sir.
With $1 billion, if you
that
get rid
is
of
absolutely you know what, you're
not
true. You're going to have
true.
Gentlemen, I hate to raise my voice, but it seems to be. Why shouldn't I be different than the two of you?
It really was. So, I mean, that was the worst presidential debate in American history. There's it's beyond any question. I think CNN will be prepared. I think ABC will be prepared. But it's completely uncharted waters. And, a lot will depend on, the demeanor of both candidates. as well. But for me, the touchstone is one I just said about how I do think that the election issues around 2020 are far and away the most important issue on another scale to everything else. But the watchword should always be, are we doing something here which makes the abnormal seem normal? And that should be the prism between, I think, which you should run all of your thoughts about covering the president and the debates and things like that.
Yeah, so you touch on there this ongoing debate among media critics and also journalists that work in politics or on air about whether you can treat Trump like any other politician, or whether he poses such a unique challenge to media that he needs to be, I suppose, treated differently or handled differently. Do you
Well, you have
factor
to.
that
I mean,
into
it's
your
not
coverage at all?
differently. He has to be handled given the way he acts.
The same standards, I suppose, right? Because I think there's a different standards for his commentary because of the nature
Well,
of
what
it.
we end up, because there's so much, we end up ignoring things that we would never ignore if someone else
Right.
said or did them. Number one, that's a problem. I'm not suggesting any of this is easy. I, for one, will not allow on my programs sound from Trump that is demonstrably untrue. We used to show it and then say it's not true. That doesn't work. You can't show it. You can just say he repeated another lie. The problem with that, if you're still going to cover him, is you actually end up sanitizing him in a way. You're weeding out 80% of what he says, and putting in the one thing he says about electric cars or whatever, and that actually ends up making him look like a normal candidate as well, when in fact 80% of his speech was attacking his opponents, calling judges evil and repeating lies about the 2020 election. So it's a very complicated issue.
You have an interesting, and I would say it's fairly effective method of interviewing subjects that might be a little more misleading than others that I've noticed recently. You ask a question, and if the response is misleading or unsatisfactory, you have a concise fact check laying out competing context or a correction, and then you move on to the next question. Is that something that you developed for the Trump era, or is that something you've always done?
I mean, it depends. Or if I think it's important enough, I won't move on. With
Right.
Recent interview I had with Chris Sununu, if it's about the 2020 election and him all of a sudden suggesting that doesn't matter when before he was quite critical, that's the only thing I'll end up talking about it. But no, I have no problem if someone says something that's not true. Just saying that. And when you say move on, I generally tend to end the interview as opposed to moving on to other subjects. Because that's what I'm coming to myself. I don't think, I can only speak for myself. I can only speak for my programs. We can't be in the business of broadcasting falsehoods. And it's an issue, you're seeing beyond President Trump. I mean, I was reading about an interview Senator Rubio did over the last weekend, where he repeated a series of false claims about the 2020 election. And what you see now is others adopting the Trump technique of, if you're called out on a lie, you simply don't care.
Right.
And so I think it actually leads to broader questions about what we should allow on our airwaves at all. I mean, and clearly you want as many perspectives as you can, but I think that the admission ticket to being on television should be coming on with a commitment to tell the truth.
I've been heartened recently by the fact that Trump seems to be the only figure that is able to successfully pull off lying about an election. You've seen like Kari Lake claim that her election was stolen. A couple other figures suggest that there were problems with their elections. And fortunately, it hasn't been taken as seriously as Trump's claims about 2020 were. But do you think that election denialism is something that we're now going to have to deal with for the long run?
It's fundamental right now. Right. I mean, it is the fundamental fact of Trump's reelection campaign. The thing he talks about more than anything else when he's on the stump is about the election being stolen in 2020 and the warning that it's going to be stolen again, which he says basically any election he loses has been stolen. And you see, again, it's not limited to him. Everyone who's auditioning to be his vice president will not repeat that. They will accept the results of the election. So yeah, it's a huge problem.
One thing also that I think Trump has brought into our politics is the use of defamation cases against reporters. Trump sued you and I believe ABC News over your reporting.
Right, and we filed a motion to dismiss.
Yeah, I mean, I always find it interesting when these lawsuits drop, because internally at ABC, I'm sure the lawsuit is being taken seriously, but it doesn't have any chance of survival because, beyond there not being a case, U.S. defamation cases are really hard to bring because thankfully we have such robust First Amendment protections.
He sued me for something where I showed a newspaper clip backing up what I said. I mean, it's you can't.
Well, but it's interesting because we're now in because of these media silos that you brought up earlier. I will sometimes see on Twitter, you'll see, partisans cheering on these lawsuits saying like, oh, I can't wait for this, to take ABC News down or something like that. Does that kind of legal action bother you, or is it just a sort of mildly amusing but inconvenient side effect of covering news in 2024?
I mean, more the latter than the former. I'm not. I mean, I think the worst thing that could happen is if somehow he were able to gain something out of doing things like that, which is a chilling effect.
Right.
And you can't allow that to happen.
I think it's fair to say that you can sometimes take an outsized amount of heat from conservatives compared to the other Sunday show anchors. Do you feel that, and what do you make of that?
I honestly don't even. I pay no attention.
You pay no attention. You don't get the emails. You're not. Are you on Twitter at all?
I mean, I'll look at it every once in a while, but I don't. It doesn't. I don't alter my performance based on what a bunch of people are yelling on Twitter.
Are you watching Fox News?
No.
Interesting. I do want to ask you about Fox because you worked in the Clinton administration, and these days the pipeline of White House officials to cable or broadcast news is well established. It's been going on for a while. Dana Perino obviously went from the Bush administration to Fox, but now we see Trump's press secretaries finding homes at Fox, Biden's comms team landing at MSNBC. That sparks criticism sometimes that there's like a revolving door between presidential administrations and these networks.
And I faced it, and Diane Sawyer faced it, and Tony Snow faced. I mean, it's been an issue for a long time. Carl Rowan worked in the Johnson administration.
Do you think it's a silly criticism? Do you ever find it compelling, or?
I mean, I think that it's important that people be transparent about what's happening. And people do the jobs they're hired to do with integrity and character. But I think that just the idea that somehow working in government makes you disqualified to later work in journalism, I think is just wrong.
We lose a lot of contributors too, I feel.
Yeah.
What now? Certain times I think there is a difference. I'm thinking of one Trump press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, who played a significant role in the denial of the 2020 election. And now she's a pretty reliable Trump booster on Fox. Do you think that someone like that should be on the air at a news network?
I can only speak for my programs. And I think if you're denying the results of the election, that is a fundamental, it's an affront to our system. It's dishonest. And that's sort of disqualifying in terms of being a journalist or an analyst.
Now, I want to go back to the debates a little bit. Do you think that this is a riskier prospect, these two debates, for Trump or Biden?
It's just so hard to know, and we'll see if both debates happen.
Do you think there's a chance they would?
There's always a chance. I mean, how many times have people turned around on stuff like that in the past? I think a lot depends on how the first one goes. I hope both happen.
Yeah.
I think it's important, but I don't know what each candidate is going to feel like after the first debate. It depends on what happens in that first debate, and in the end, they're the ones who decide whether or not they want to do it. But there's no question these debates are going to matter. And they're going to have massive, massive audiences. And, especially in an election where that is going to be decided at the margins, everything, something that is that big an event is going to have an outsized impact.
Do you think that there is some denialism in the Democratic Party about how strong a candidate Biden is? I mean, he's not young. There's a lot of calls from media folks for him to drop out. Do you think that that's a concern that they have? And would that be a concern that you would have if you were advising his campaign?
Well, I'm not going to speak to that, but I mean, clearly there's a lot of Democrats who are concerned, and it's a concern that shows up in the polling. So then it's on puts the onus on the president and his team to demonstrate that he is up to the job. And I think that's one of the reasons he chose to, lay down the gauntlet and say, let's go have the debate.
A lot of ink has been spilled about what a second Trump term would look like. What do you think happens if Trump comes back to power? What are your sort of top line
Again,
thoughts
what
on
you have
that?
to do is listen to what he says. I mean, he says he's going to pardon the January 6th rioters. He says he's going to drop the cases against himself.
As everyone knows, it will be my great honor to pardon the peaceful January 6th protesters, or as I often call them, the hostages. They're hostages.
Arguably obstruction of justice. When you do that, you're blocking. I mean, think about that. I mean, again, this talk about the normalization in the fifth paragraph of stories about what Trump would do. They just say, oh, these trials may not happen this year, and that means if he gets elected, he's just going to drop them. And it's just all said without comment, as if that's like a totally legitimate thing to do, to turn off an investigation into yourself. It's not.
Right.
I mean, imagine, to flip it around, if Joe Biden had thrown out the prosecution of Hunter Biden. What would we be talking about? Anything else?
George Stephanopoulos, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
I enjoyed it. Thanks, Aidan.